Commodore Laura Bennett and her first strike fleet emerged from quantum speed at the edge of the Valkyrie home system, and what they saw made even the most optimistic crew members fall silent. The Valkyrie homeworld was a jewel of blue and green, hanging in space surrounded by hundreds of orbital habitats that glittered like a crown. Massive shipyards orbited the planet alongside defensive platforms that bristled with weapons. The Valkyrie fleet numbered in the hundreds, and they moved in perfect formations that spoke of centuries of military tradition. This was not some frontier outpost that could be overwhelmed by surprise and desperation. This was the heart of an empire that had ruled this region of space for longer than human civilization had existed. Laura knew that her 30 ships could not possibly win a conventional battle against those odds, but winning was not the point of this mission. The point was to make the Valkyrie hurt, and to prove that humanity could reach across the stars and strike back. She opened a fleet-wide channel and gave the order that would begin the battle. All ships attack at will and make every shot count. For Earth and for everyone we lost. Then she transmitted the message that President Sullivan had crafted and Professor Gary Mitchell had translated into perfect Valkyrie. The aliens would hear it in their own language moments before human weapons began to fire. Commander Srax led the Valkyrie home defense fleet from his flagship, and he had been monitoring the edge of the system when the human vessels appeared. He felt something close to amusement when he saw how few ships the primitives had brought. The initial attack on the mining outpost had been a surprise, but this was suicide. He opened a channel to the human fleet and offered them one chance to surrender and accept subjugation as a vassal species. The response came back in flawless Valkyrie, and the words made his scales ripple with shock. You struck our world. You killed our children. Now we are coming for yours. No mercy, no surrender. This is humanity's answer. The human ships scattered and accelerated in different directions, and Srax realized too late that they were not trying to fight his fleet directly. They were targeting the civilian orbital habitats and the shipyards and the infrastructure that kept the Valkyrie homeworld functioning. He ordered his fleet to intercept, but the human vessels were faster than his intelligence reports had indicated, and they moved with a recklessness that bordered on insanity. They did not care about taking damage or preserving their ships. They only cared about inflicting as much harm as possible before they were destroyed. Jack Donovan launched from the carrier Vengeance along with 200 other fighters, and they screamed toward the nearest shipyard at maximum acceleration. The Valkyrie defensive platforms opened fire, and the space around him filled with energy beams and explosive rounds. Fighters to his left and right disappeared in balls of flame, but Jack kept flying because stopping meant dying, and dying before he hurt the enemy was unacceptable. He armed his missiles and locked onto the shipyard's main reactor. His targeting computer screamed warnings about the defensive fire, but he ignored them and fired everything he had. For Earth and for Sarah and for the kids, he thought as his missiles impacted, and the shipyard began to tear itself apart. Then a Valkyrie interceptor got a lock on him, and Jack's fighter exploded before he could even register the hit. Lisa Morgan and her boarding teams rode breaching pods toward a Valkyrie command carrier that was trying to coordinate the defense. The pods were basically missiles with people inside, and the ride was violent enough to break bones if you were not strapped in properly. They hit the carrier's hull at high speed, and the shaped charges blew through the armor plating. Lisa was first through the breach and into the alien ship with her weapon up and ready. The Valkyrie crew were tall and fast, but they had not expected boarders, and Lisa's team moved through the corridors with brutal efficiency. She led her Marines toward the command center, using the layout that Dr. Freeman's team had extrapolated from Laura's reconnaissance data. They encountered Valkyrie security forces, and the fighting was close and savage. The aliens were stronger, but humans were meaner, and they had been training for this exact scenario for months. Lisa's team used grenades and breaching charges and overwhelming firepower to clear each section. When they reached the command center, she personally shot the locks off the door and threw in a flashbang. Before storming inside, the Valkyrie officers inside were temporarily blinded and disoriented, and Lisa's Marines subdued them before they could recover. She pulled out the data spike that Dr. Freeman had designed and jammed it into what looked like the main computer terminal. The virus began uploading immediately, and Lisa watched the progress bar tick upward while her team held the doorway against Valkyrie reinforcements trying to retake the command center. The upload finished, and Lisa ordered her Marines to fall back to the breaching pods. They fought their way back through the corridors, leaving a trail of bodies behind them. Half her team made it back to the pods, and they blasted away from the carrier just as the fires took full effect and shut down the ship's systems. Laura's flagship took hit after hit from Valkyrie weapons, but she kept pressing the attack. Sam Cooper coordinated the fleet's targeting, and they focused on maximum damage to infrastructure rather than trying to destroy military vessels. Orbital habitats breached in vented atmosphere. Shipyards exploded in chain reactions. Defensive platforms went dark as their power systems failed. The Valkyrie fleet was powerful, but it was also spread out, trying to defend too many targets at once, and the human ships exploited every gap in their coverage. Nina Torres kept the flagship's systems running through damage that should have been catastrophic. Hull breaches were sealed with emergency patches. Overheating weapons were cycled to prevent total failure. The quantum drive was held together with literal prayers and improvised repairs. She knew the ship would not survive much longer, but she also knew that every minute they stayed in the fight was another minute of damage inflicted on the enemy. The human fleet was being torn apart, but they took the Valkyrie homeworld's defenses with them. The destroyer Fury rammed a defensive platform at full speed, and both exploded in a fireball visible from the planet's surface. The frigate Justice lost all power but continued to drift toward a shipyard, while the crew manually launched their remaining missiles. The carrier Vengeance took a direct hit to its reactor and went critical, but the captain aimed his dying ship at an orbital habitat and evacuated the crew before impact. Admiral Helen Carter arrived with the Second Fleet exactly when Laura had predicted she would. Helen had departed Earth weeks after Laura, but with faster ships, and she timed her arrival to coincide with the moment when the Valkyrie defenses would be in maximum disarray. 20 fresh human warships dropped out of quantum speed and immediately opened fire on the reeling Valkyrie fleet. The aliens had been fighting for hours, and their formations were broken, and their ammunition was running low. The arrival of reinforcements hit them like a hammer blow. Commander Zrax watched his carefully ordered defenses collapse into chaos and finally understood what his species had done. They had not attacked primitive savages who would roll over and die. They had attacked survivors and fighters who would cross the galaxy itself to deliver vengeance. His homeworld's orbital infrastructure was burning. Millions of Valkyrie civilians were dead. The shipyards that built the fleet were destroyed. And still the humans kept fighting with a fury that his honor-bound people could not match. Admiral Carter assembled the complete strategic plan and briefed President Sullivan on what was about to happen. The first strike fleet would depart immediately and head for the Valkyrie homeworld using the coordinates Laura had provided. They would arrive before the Valkyrie main fleet reached Earth. The goal was not to win, but to hurt the enemy badly enough that they would think twice about continuing the war. Hit them in their home system and make them feel the same pain and fear that humans had felt. Show them that humanity could reach across the stars and strike back. President Sullivan approved the plan, and then called Professor Gary Mitchell to her office. His linguistics team had finally cracked enough of the Valkyrie language to compose a proper message. She told him what she wanted to say, and Gary worked with his team to translate it perfectly. The message would be transmitted to the Valkyrie Empire in their own language moments before the human fleet attacked. It needed to be simple and clear and leave no room for misunderstanding. You struck our world. You killed our children. Now we are coming for yours. No mercy, no surrender. This is humanity's answer. The first strike fleet assembled in high orbit above Earth, and Laura stood on the bridge of her flagship watching the planet turn slowly below. She thought about all the people down there who were counting on her, and on the thousands of other crew members scattered across 30 warships. They were going to take humanity's rage across 70 light-years of empty space and deliver it directly to the enemy's doorstep. The Valkyrie had thought humans would be easy prey, but they were about to learn the hard way that some prey fought back. Jack Donovan sat in the cockpit of his fighter in the launch bay of the carrier Vengeance and ran through his pre-flight checks for the 100th time. His squadron commander had told them that their survival rate in the coming battle was estimated at less than 30%. Jack had acknowledged the briefing and then volunteered to fly point position anyway. He was not afraid of dying because the worst thing that could happen to him already had. All he wanted now was the chance to make the Valkyrie hurt the way he hurt. Lisa Morgan gathered her boarding teams in the troop bay and gave them the final equipment inspection. They wore heavy armor and carried weapons designed for close-quarters brutality. Their objective would be to capture Valkyrie command ships if possible, or destroy them if capture was not feasible. The intelligence gathered from enemy computer systems could be invaluable for the larger war effort. But more than that, Lisa wanted to look the aliens in their multiple eyes and make them understand what they had brought down on themselves. The fleet received final clearance from Earth Defense Command, and Laura gave the order to jump. 30 ships engaged their quantum drives simultaneously and disappeared in flashes of twisted light. Behind them, Earth continued to heal and to build and to prepare. Ahead of them lay the Valkyrie homeworld and the reckoning that humanity had been preparing for. The journey would take 4 months, and every day of that time the crews would train and prepare and sharpen themselves into the weapon that Earth needed them to be. The Valkyrie had struck first, but humans would have the last word, and it would be spoken in a language that transcended species and culture. The language of consequences and the promise that those who attacked humanity would learn to regret it. He opened a channel to Admiral Carter and requested negotiations. Helen let him wait for a full minute before responding, and when she did, her voice was cold as the void between stars. The Valkyrie would withdraw completely from human space. They would pay reparations for the attack on Earth. They would exchange all prisoners. And they would broadcast their defeat across their entire empire so that every species would know what happened when you struck the human homeworld. Zrax had no choice but to accept, because the alternative was watching his planet burn. The war ended not with humanity's extinction, but with their victory. The cost had been terrible. 20 ships lost and thousands of crew dead. But Earth was safe, and the Valkyrie had learned their lesson. Laura stood on the bridge of her battered flagship and looked at the Valkyrie homeworld below. Part of her wanted to reduce it to ash the way they had tried to do to Earth. But that would make humanity no better than the enemy. Instead, she would take the victory and go home and rebuild. 5 years passed, and Earth healed slowly but surely. The nuclear winter faded, and the crops began to grow again. New cities rose from the ashes of the old ones, and they were built stronger than before. The population recovered to 11 billion and growing. Memorials stood at each impact site, bearing the names of the 2 billion who had died, and every year on the anniversary, people gathered to remember and to promise that it would never happen again. Laura became admiral and oversaw the construction of humanity's first true deep space fleet. The ships were bigger and faster and more heavily armed than anything that had come before. They bore names like Remembrance and Defiant and Vengeance, and they patrolled human space with eternal vigilance. The galaxy had learned what happened when you attacked Earth, and now humanity made sure that lesson was not forgotten. President Sullivan finished her second term and addressed the United Nations one final time. She spoke about the cost of survival and the price of peace. Humanity had wanted nothing more than to explore the stars and meet their neighbors as friends. But the galaxy had taught them that survival required strength and that peace was only possible when you were too dangerous to attack. They would never forget the billions who died, and they would never again be caught unprepared. Children played in the rebuilt parks of New York and Beijing and Mumbai, and they did not remember the day the sky caught fire. But they grew up in a civilization that would never forget. They learned about the Valkyrie attack in school, and they saw the warships in orbit, and they understood that their world was protected by people who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. Humanity had declared its place among the stars, and that declaration had been written in fire and paid for in blood. The galaxy was vast and filled with wonders and dangers in equal measure. Humanity would explore it and settle it and defend it, because that was what survivors did. They endured and they prevailed, and they made sure that anyone who threatened them learned to regret it. The Valkyrie had struck Earth expecting easy victory, but they found only humanity's wrath. And now the entire galaxy knew better than to test them again. Chris Palmer had not slept in 3 days, and his hands were bleeding from digging through the rubble, but he kept working because there were still people alive under the collapsed buildings. He led a team of military engineers through what used to be downtown Boston, and the city looked like something from a nightmare. The buildings that still stood were burning, and the ones that had fallen created mountains of concrete and twisted steel that stretched for miles in every direction. His team worked with cutting torches and hydraulic lifts to create paths through the debris, and every few hours they would hear someone calling for help from deep in the wreckage. The air tasted like smoke and chemicals, and everyone wore masks to filter out the worst of it, but the ash still got into everything. Chris had pulled 17 people out alive in the last 2 days, and he tried not to think about the hundreds they had found who were already gone. His radio crackled with reports from other teams working in different parts of the ruined city, and the numbers were always the same. Too many dead and not enough hands to dig through all the rubble. The tsunami had hit the coast like a hammer, and then the fires had spread inland and consumed everything that the water had not already destroyed. Amy Rodriguez worked in a field hospital that had been set up in what used to be a parking garage because most of the actual hospitals were either destroyed or too damaged to use. She had been a doctor for 8 years, but nothing in medical school had prepared her for this. The injured came in waves, and there were never enough beds or supplies or hands to help them all. Burns and radiation sickness and crushing injuries that should have killed people, but somehow had not. She moved from patient to patient, doing what she could, with what she had and trying not to look at. The ones who were too far gone to save, a young girl, came in with her mother, and both of them were covered in ash and blood. The mother had a piece of glass embedded in her shoulder, but she refused treatment until Amy looked at her daughter first. The girl was maybe 7 years old, and she stared at Amy with eyes that had seen too much. Amy checked her over and found nothing seriously wrong beyond some cuts and bruises, but the psychological damage would take years to heal if it ever did. She bandaged the girl and then treated the mother and sent them both to the recovery area where volunteers were handing out food and water to anyone who needed it. Admiral Helen Carter stood in the command center deep beneath what remained of Washington and studied the maps on the wall screens. The impacts had created 3 massive disaster zones, and the cascading failures were spreading outward, like ripples in a pond. Power grids were down across most of North America and Asia. Food distribution networks had collapsed. Millions of refugees were fleeing the impact zones and overwhelming the infrastructure in areas that had not been directly hit. She had ordered every military unit on the planet to assist with rescue and relief efforts, but there simply were not enough resources to help everyone who needed it. Her chief science advisor, Paul Freeman, came into the command center carrying a tablet, and his face told her that he had found something important. She gestured for him to speak, and he pulled up a holographic display showing the analysis of material recovered from the impact sites. The projectiles had been made from an alloy that did not exist naturally anywhere in the solar system, and the composition matched nothing in any database. The trajectory calculations showed that they had come from outside human-explored space, and the velocity meant they must have been accelerated by some kind of propulsion system. This was not a natural disaster, and it was not an accident. Someone had built these weapons and aimed them at Earth and fired them with the intention of killing as many humans as possible. Helen felt her jaw tighten, and she asked the question, even though she already knew what the answer would be. Paul confirmed that the projectiles had come from a region of space about 70 light-years away, and that human probes had surveyed that area decades ago, but found no signs of intelligent life. Either the survey had missed something, or whoever lived there had not wanted to be found. Either way, they had struck first and struck hard, and now Earth needed to know who they were and whether more attacks were coming. She called for Captain Laura Bennett, and when the woman arrived, Helen gave her the mission. That would change everything. Laura was young for a ship captain, but she was smart and brave, and she did not hesitate when given difficult orders. Helen told her to take a small flotilla to the origin point of the attack and find out who had done this. The journey would take months, even with the experimental quantum drives, and there was no guarantee that Laura and her crew would come back alive. Laura saluted and said she would leave within the week, and Helen saw the same cold anger in her eyes that everyone felt now. Professor Gary Mitchell led a team of linguists who were working around the clock to decode alien transmissions that had been intercepted by deep space monitoring stations. The signals had been detected hours after the impact, and at first no one had known what they were. Gary had spent his entire career studying dead languages and theoretical alien communication, but he had never actually expected to encounter real alien signals. The transmissions were complex and used mathematical patterns that were similar enough to human communication that Gary believed he could crack them given enough time. His team worked in shifts and slowly began to piece together a basic understanding of the alien language. The breakthrough came on the 4th day when they realized the aliens were using a base 16 counting system instead of base 10. Once they had that key, the rest began to fall into place. Gary felt excitement and dread in equal measure as the first translated messages appeared on his screen. The aliens called themselves the Vakri, and they were discussing Earth in terms that made Gary's blood run cold. They referred to humans as vermin and competitors, and the attack had been authorized by their high command as a preemptive extermination. The Valkyrie had expected their weapons to wipe out human civilization completely, and the transmission showed surprise that any humans had survived at all. They were now debating whether to send a second wave of attacks or wait to see if the humans died off on their own from the environmental damage. Gary printed out the translations and took them directly to Admiral Carter, because this information could not wait. She read through the documents twice, and her expression grew harder with each page. The Valkyrie had declared war on humanity without even bothering to make contact first, and now they were deciding whether to finish the job. Laura Bennett prepared her ship, the Horizon Runner, for the long journey ahead and selected the best crew she could find from the volunteers who wanted to go. Everyone knew this was likely a one-way trip, but the line of people wanting to serve stretched around the block. Humanity had been knocked down hard, but they were getting back up, and they wanted answers and they wanted revenge. Laura chose people who could keep their heads under pressure and who understood that this mission was about more than just revenge. Earth needed intelligence on the Valkyrie and their capabilities, because another attack was almost certainly coming. Her flotilla consisted of 5 ships, and they departed from lunar orbit exactly 1 week after the impacts. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but Laura felt no fear as her ship jumped to quantum speed and the solar system fell away behind them. The Valkyrie had struck Earth and killed billions of innocent people, but they had made a terrible mistake. They had assumed that one attack would be enough to destroy humanity, but they did not understand what they had awakened. Humans were survivors and fighters, and they did not give up just because the odds were against them. Laura looked at her crew and saw that same determination reflected in every face. They were going hunting, and the Valkyrie would learn what it meant to make an enemy of Earth. Admiral Helen Carter received Laura's transmission 6 weeks after the battle at the Valkyrie outpost and immediately convened the military leadership in the command bunker. The news was both good and bad in equal measure. Laura had destroyed the second attack force, but in doing so, had provoked the full might of the Valkyrie Empire. Their main fleet was coming, and it would arrive at Earth in approximately 6 months. Helen looked at the strategic display showing Earth's current defensive capabilities and knew with cold certainty that they could not win a defensive battle. The only option was to take the fight to the enemy first. President Kate Sullivan stood before the United Nations Assembly and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Earth's population had stabilized at 10 billion after months of recovery efforts, but the planet was still struggling to feed everyone. The impacts had triggered a nuclear winter effect, and crops were failing across the globe. Millions faced starvation and disease. The infrastructure was slowly being rebuilt, but it would take years to return to pre-attack levels. And now they had 6 months to prepare for total war against an enemy that had been spacefaring. For thousands of years, while humans had barely left their own solar system, she asked for and received unanimous authorization to convert the entire solar system into a war economy. Every shipyard and factory and resource extraction operation would be redirected toward military production. Every able-bodied person would contribute in whatever way they could. This was not about conquest or expansion. This was about survival. The Valkyrie had declared that humanity was vermin to be exterminated, and Earth's answer would be written in fire, and Steele Ryan Clark oversaw the transformation of civilian infrastructure into military production, and the scale of the project was unlike anything in human history. Cargo haulers were stripped down and rebuilt as missile frigates. Mining ships became torpedo boats. Construction platforms that had been building orbital habitats were retooled to assemble warships. Ryan worked 20-hour days coordinating the efforts of millions of workers across dozens of facilities. The ships they produced were crude compared to what the Valkyrie had, but they were functional, and they were being built fast. Michelle Torres managed the weapons manufacturing and pushed her teams to innovate beyond anything they had previously thought possible. She studied the data Laura had sent back about Valkyrie shields and armor, and designed munitions specifically to counter them. Kinetic penetrators that could punch through energy barriers, nuclear-tipped missiles with shape charges to maximize damage, experimental plasma cannons that ran so hot they could only fire a few shots before burning out. Nothing was elegant or sophisticated, but everything was designed to kill, and that was all that mattered now. Jack Donovan had lost his wife and 2 children in the Atlantic tsunami, and when the recruitment centers opened, he was first in line to volunteer. He had been a civilian cargo pilot before the attack, but now he trained on military fighters and learned how to dogfight in zero gravity. The instructors pushed the recruits hard because there was no time for a lengthy training program. They had 6 months to turn civilians into warriors, and every day counted. Jack absorbed everything they taught him and practiced until his hands moved on the controls without conscious thought. He dreamed about the moment he would face the Valkyrie in combat and make them pay for what they had taken from him. Lisa, Morgan had been a police officer before the attack, and now she was a Marine sergeant training boarding parties for ship-to-ship combat. The Valkyrie were physically larger and stronger than humans, but Lisa taught her troops to use that against them. Speed and aggression and tactics that the honor-bound aliens would never expect. Fight dirty and fight mean and never give the enemy a chance to use their advantages. Her Marines practiced in mock-up corridors that simulated Valkyrie ship interiors, and they drilled until they could clear rooms and secure objectives in their sleep. Dr. Paul Freeman led a team of scientists who worked around the clock to improve human technology using every scrap of data Laura had sent back. The quantum drives were enhanced and their speed doubled through modifications that pushed the engines right to the edge of catastrophic failure. Shield generators were improved by copying principles observed in Valkyrie defensive systems. Sensor arrays were upgraded to detect enemy ships at longer ranges. Every advancement was rushed through, testing and deployed immediately, because perfect was the enemy of good enough, and humanity did not have time for perfect. Captain Laura Bennett returned to Earth after her 4-month journey and found a world transformed by purpose and determination. She was met at the orbital docks by Admiral Carter, who promoted her to Commodore on the spot and gave her command of the First Strike Fleet. 30 warships representing everything humanity could spare would be her responsibility. Laura walked through the fleet assembly area and looked at the ships that would carry Earth's counterattack. They were ugly and utilitarian and bristled with weapons. They were built by people who had watched their world burn and who refused to let it happen again. The crews that came aboard were a mix of military veterans and civilian volunteers, and every single one of them had lost someone in the attacks. They came from every nation and culture on Earth, but they were united by grief and rage and determination. Laura addressed them over the fleet-wide channel and did not try to sugarcoat what they faced. The Valkyrie had superior technology and numerical advantage. Many of the people listening to her would not survive the coming battle, but they would make the enemy pay for every human life with 10 of their own. They would show the Valkyrie what happened when you struck the human homeworld. Ryan Clark finished the last of the major warship conversions 2 weeks ahead of schedule and immediately began work on support vessels, ammunition haulers and repair ships and medical frigates that would keep the fleet operating far from home. Michelle Torres delivered the final weapons shipments and watched as crews loaded them into the magazines of waiting warships. Every missile and every torpedo and every plasma charge represented months of work by thousands of people who had poured their skills and their anger into creating instruments of vengeance. Laura Bennett and her flotilla dropped out of quantum speed at the edge of the target system and immediately went dark to avoid detection. The journey had taken 4 months, and her crew was exhausted but alert because they all knew what was at stake here. The sensors began painting a picture of the system, and what they saw made Laura's stomach sink. A massive space station orbited a blue and green gas giant, and dozens of smaller vessels moved around it like insects around a hive. This was not some abandoned outpost or research station. This was a military installation, and it was very much active. She ordered her ships to maintain their distance and to keep all emissions to minimum while they observed and recorded everything. The station was at least 10 times larger than anything humanity had ever built, and its design was alien in ways that made her head hurt when she looked at it too long. Curved surfaces and organic shapes instead of the straight lines and right angles that human engineers preferred. Her science officer ran continuous scans and identified weapon emplacements and shield generators and power sources that operated on principles they did not fully understand. The alien ships were sleek and dangerous looking, and they moved with a grace that suggested advanced propulsion systems. Laura counted at least 20 warships of various sizes, along with numerous support craft and mining vessels. The Valkyrie were clearly using this system to extract resources from the gas giant and its moons. She watched through the long-range cameras as the aliens went about their business, and she got her first good look at the species that had attacked Earth. They were tall and reptilian, with scales that shimmered in shades of green and brown. Multiple eyes gave them wide field of vision, and their movements were quick and precise. For 3 days, Laura and her crew watched and recorded and analyzed everything they could see. Sam Cooper, her tactical officer, worked constantly to map out the station's defenses and identify weak points. Nina Torres, the chief engineer, studied the alien ships and tried to understand how their technology worked. The picture that emerged was not encouraging. The Valkyrie had better shields and more powerful weapons than anything in the human arsenal. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable. In a straight fight, humanity would lose badly. On the fourth day, the sensors detected something that changed everything. A large transport vessel arrived at the station and began loading cylindrical objects that the scanners identified as identical in composition to the projectiles that had struck Earth. The Valkyrie were preparing another attack, and from the number of weapons being loaded, it would be even larger than the first. Laura called her senior officers together, and they discussed their options. In the cramped conference room of the Horizon, Runner Sam argued that they should immediately return to Earth with this intelligence so that humanity could prepare defenses. Nina pointed out that even with the quantum drives, it would take 4 months to get back, and by then the Valkyrie attack fleet might already be on its way. Laura listened to both sides and then made the decision that would define the rest of her life. They could not let that transport leave this system with those weapons. If they ran back to Earth now, they would arrive too late to make a difference. The only option was to attack here and now and destroy those weapons before they could be used against Earth again. Her officers stared at her in silence because they all understood what she was saying. 5 human ships against a fortified station and 20 alien warships. The odds of survival were effectively 0. But if they did nothing, then billions more humans would die and Earth might not survive a second attack. Laura gave them each the choice to stay or take a shuttle and try to make it back to human space alone. Not a single person chose to leave. They had all come here knowing they might not go home, and they were all willing to die if it meant protecting Earth. Laura planned the attack carefully and used every advantage she could think of. The Valkyrie did not know humans were here, which meant surprise was on their side. The station's weapons were designed to defend against attacks from outside the system, not from ships already inside their perimeter. The transport was large and slow and loaded with volatile weapons that would explode spectacularly if hit in the right place. She designated the transport as primary target and divided her flotilla into 2 groups. 3 ships would hit the transport while 2 would engage the station's defenses to keep them busy. They moved into position slowly, over the course of 6 hours, and Laura felt her heart hammering in her chest as the countdown ticked toward 0. She thought about Earth and about all the people who had died in the impacts and about the billions more who were counting on people like her to keep them safe. She opened a channel to all 5 ships and spoke the words that would send them into battle. For Earth and for everyone we lost, make every shot count. The attack began with a spread of missiles launched from maximum range, and the Valkyrie station's alarms started wailing immediately. The alien ships began moving to intercept, but they were too slow because they had been caught completely off guard. Laura's 3-ship group accelerated hard toward the transport, while Sam fired everything they had at its cargo bay. The first missiles impacted the transport's shields and overloaded them, and the follow-up shots punched through the hull and hit the weapons inside. The explosion was bigger than anything Laura had expected, and the shockwave buffeted the Horizon Runner even at their distance. The transport simply ceased to exist in a ball of white fire that expanded outward and consumed 2 Valkyrie warships that had been too close. The station's weapons began firing, and Laura threw her ship into evasive maneuvers as energy beams sliced through space where they had been moments before. Nina shouted that the shields were taking heavy damage, and Laura ordered all power redirected from life support to keep them up. Sam coordinated the attack with brutal efficiency and targeted the station's weapon storage just like they had planned. The other human ships pressed their attacks even as Valkyrie fire tore into them. The frigate Carson took a direct hit to its engine section and exploded in a flash of debris. The destroyer Maxwell lost its forward shields and tried to ram a Valkyrie cruiser, but was destroyed before it could make contact. Laura felt each loss like a knife to her gut, but she kept flying and kept fighting because stopping now would make their sacrifices meaningless. The human missiles finally penetrated the station's weapon storage, and this time the explosion was even larger than the transport. Secondary detonations rippled through the structure, and whole sections of the station broke apart and spun away into space. The Valkyrie fleet tried to regroup, but Laura's remaining ships hit them with everything they had left. It was chaos and violence and desperation all mixed together. The corvette Preston went down fighting and took a Valkyrie destroyer with it. The frigate Houston limped away with half its crew dead and its hull breached in a dozen places. Laura's ship was barely holding together, and Nina reported that they had maybe 10 minutes of combat capability left before the power systems failed completely. Sam managed to get off one last spread of missiles at a Valkyrie command ship and scored direct hits that left it drifting and powerless. Then Laura ordered the retreat, and her 2 surviving ships ran for the edge of the system while the remaining Valkyrie vessels pursued. They made it to minimum safe distance for quantum jump with seconds to spare, and Laura engaged the drive even though Nina warned it was not fully charged. The Horizon runner lurched into faster-than-light speed, and the Valkyrie system disappeared behind them. In the sudden silence that followed, Laura took stock of what they had accomplished and what it had cost. 3 ships lost and hundreds of crew dead, but the Valkyrie outpost was destroyed, and the second attack on Earth would not happen. She ordered her communications officer to send everything they had recorded back to Earth on a tight beam transmission. Then she intercepted a Valkyrie military broadcast and listened as their high command reacted to the attack. The aliens were shocked that the primitive humans had not only survived but had struck back. They were now ordering a full military mobilization, and their main fleet would be sent to crush humanity once and for all. Laura set course for Earth, knowing they had bought humanity time, but also knowing that a much larger war was coming. The Valkyrie had struck Earth expecting easy victory, and instead they had awakened something they did not understand. Humans did not give up, and they did not forgive, and they would fight to the last breath to protect their world. She looked at the battered faces of her surviving crew and saw the same grim determination that she felt. They were going home to warn Earth that the real war was about to begin. Jake Morrison sat in his command chair aboard the orbital defense station Liberty Prime and watched the stars like he did every night shift. The coffee in his metal cup had gone cold an hour ago, but he drank it anyway because that was what you did when you pulled the midnight watch. His crew was small but efficient, and they knew their jobs well enough that Jake rarely had to give orders anymore. Lisa Grant monitored the tactical displays while Peter Hughes kept the communication channels open and running smooth. They were good people, and Jake trusted them with his life. Even though most nights nothing ever happened up here, and the black earth turned slowly below them, and Jake could see the lights of a dozen major cities sparkling like jewels against the dark continents. 12 billion people down there living their lives and sleeping in their beds and trusting that people like Jake would keep them safe from whatever dangers lurked in the void. It was a responsibility he took seriously, even when the job felt boring and repetitive. The defense grid had been operating for 30 years without a single major incident, and most people had forgotten why it even existed. Jake had not forgotten because his grandfather had lived through the asteroid scare of 2089 when a rock the size of a mountain had come within 10,000 miles of wiping out half of Asia. Lisa suddenly sat up, straight in her chair, and her fingers moved quickly across her control panel. Jake saw the change in her posture and felt his stomach tighten even before she spoke. Something was wrong, and his instincts knew it before his brain caught up. Lisa turned to look at him, and her face had gone pale under the blue glow of her displays. The sensors are picking up multiple contacts entering the solar system, and they are moving fast. Too fast for asteroids, and the velocity does not match any known trajectory. Jake stood up and moved to her station to look at the data himself. 3 objects were racing toward Earth at speeds that should have been impossible for anything without a propulsion system. They had appeared at the edge of sensor range only minutes ago, and they were already past the orbit of Mars. He felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. Sound the alert, and get me a weapons lock on those contacts. His voice came out steady even though his hands wanted to shake. Peter was already sending emergency broadcasts to Earth Defense Command and to every military installation on the planet. The klaxons began wailing throughout Liberty Prime, and the skeleton night crew scrambled to their battle stations. Jake pulled up the trajectory calculations and felt his heart sink when he saw where those objects were heading. All 3 were on collision courses with Earth, and at their current speed they would impact in less than 20 minutes. He opened a channel to Admiral Helen Carter at Defense Command, but the connection was poor and filled with static. The objects were doing something to the electromagnetic spectrum, and communications were degrading fast. Jake managed to relay the critical information before the channel died completely. 3 inbound projectiles in less than 20 minutes to impact. He did not need to say what everyone was already thinking. 20 minutes was not enough time to evacuate anyone or shoot down objects. Moving that fast, Lisa worked frantically to get targeting solutions, but the objects were already too close and moving too fast for the defense station's weapons to track properly. Jake watched helplessly as the first projectile entered Earth's atmosphere over the Atlantic Ocean. The friction should have burned it up, but whatever these things were made of, they punched through the air like it was not even there. The impact came exactly 17 minutes after first detection, and Jake saw the flash even from orbit. A ball of white fire erupted from the ocean and spread outward in a ring that seemed to swallow the horizon. The second projectile hit Central Asia 3 seconds later, and this time there was no ocean to absorb the impact. The explosion was so bright that the optical sensors automatically dimmed to protect themselves. Jake knew that anyone looking up at the sky from the ground would have been blinded instantly. The third projectile struck North America, and Jake watched as the continent lit up like someone had set off 1,000 nuclear bombs at once. He gripped the edge of Lisa's console so hard his knuckles went white, and he forgot how to breathe. Peter was receiving fragmented reports from the ground, and his voice cracked as he read them aloud. Coastal cities along the Atlantic were gone, and the tsunami was still spreading outward like the hand of an angry god. The Asian impact had created a crater 50 miles wide, and the thermal pulse had ignited everything within 200 miles. North America was reporting complete loss of communication from everything west of the Mississippi River. The numbers scrolling across the displays did not make sense because human brains were not designed to process death on that scale. Jake forced himself to think and to act even though part of him wanted to curl up and scream. He ordered Lisa to get every optical sensor pointed at Earth and to record everything. If humanity survived this, they would need to know what had happened. Peter managed to restore partial communications with a few ground stations, and the reports that came through painted a picture of hell on Earth. Cities were burning, and the ash was already beginning to block out the sun. Millions were dead in the first few minutes, and millions more would follow as the fires spread and the infrastructure collapsed. Admiral Carter's voice suddenly crackled through on the emergency channel, and she sounded like she had aged 20 years in the last 20 minutes. Jake gave her everything he had on the impacts and the trajectory data. She listened in silence, and when she spoke again, her voice was hard as steel. Those were not asteroids, and they did not come from anywhere in our solar system. Someone attacked us deliberately, and we need to find out who and why. Jake felt rage replace the shock and grief that had paralyzed him. Someone had done this on purpose and killed billions of innocent people who had never hurt anyone. He looked at Lisa and Peter and saw the same anger reflected in their faces. They were warriors now, whether they wanted to be or not, because Earth had been struck, and humanity would need every able body to respond. Down on the surface, people were dying in numbers too large to count, but some were surviving, and they would need help. The defense grid had failed to stop the attack, but maybe it could help with what came next. President Kate Sullivan addressed the survivors 12 hours after the impacts from a bunker deep underground. Her message was broadcast on every remaining channel, and her voice did not waver, even though her eyes were red from crying. We have been attacked by an enemy we did not know existed, and they have killed 2 billion of our brothers and sisters. This was an act of war, and we will not bow down to whoever did this. We will survive, and we will find them, and we will make them pay for what they have done to our world. Humanity has been struck, but we are not broken, and we will have our answer.